Okay, let's talk about the different modes of inheritance. And let's start by discussing some genetic terms. What's a chromosome? As I said, the chromosome is a condensed part of the DNA molecule. It's when the DNA condenses prior to the cell division. And it's composed of thousands of genes. What's a gene? A gene is a segment on the DNA molecule that is located at a particular site of the chromosome. Don't forget, one single gene is going to be coding for one single protein. You inherit a defective gene, you will make a defective protein, and this is nothing but a disease. Allele is the copy of the gene that came either from your father or from your mother. So we simply can say, what is the allele? It's your father's opinion about a certain structure or function in your body. It's your mother's opinion. If the two alleles, and this will determine, the allele is going to determine your genotype. What alleles do you have in your genes? This is going to be your genotype. The phenotype is what you actually gonna look like. So let me give you an example. If the two alleles that came from your father and mother said the same opinion, like I want the eye brown, and your mother's opinion was I want the eye brown, this is a homozygous situation. So what's a homozygous situation? When the two alleles say the same thing. One pair of chromosome having identical gene forms or alleles. When the two alleles say two different opinions, like your father says, I want her eye to be brown, your mother says, I want her eye to be blue, then you're going to have two different alleles, and this situation is called heterozygous situation. Now, what is your phenotype going to be? If you have a genotype of one gene saying brown eye and one gene saying, for example, blue eye, what are you going to actually look like? If you are going to look with a brown eye, we're going to call the brown eye gene a dominant gene. So what's a dominant gene? It's the allele that presents itself whenever present, regardless of the other allele. I don't care about the other allele that says blue eye. I'm dominant. The brown eye color is a dominant. The recessive is going to be will be apparent when the two alleles say the same thing in a homozygous situation. Some diseases are inherited via a single gene inheritance, and this is what we call the Mendelian inheritance. And we can predict the inheritance of these diseases by using this simple Punnett square that I'm sure all of you are aware of. Since it's biology 101, you do this Punnett square, and we're not going to go through this Punnett square more today. Sometimes we need to do the pedigree chart. When you are counseling a patient for a genetic disease, you want to trace up the history of this genetic disease. So you start asking this patient, any of your father or your mother have the disease, and then do you think that can you remember your grandfather or your grandmother? And we keep tracing it and drawing this pedigree chart and trying to identify who was the first person in this family who developed this manifestation, and this person we're going to call it the proband, and then we're going to ask about the siblings, about the cousins, and we draw this pedigree chart to have an idea about the transmission of this genetic disease or this genetic character across the different generations. This table summarizes most of the important diseases that are transmitted by a single gene disorder. Again, we're not going to discuss them today, but just I want to give you an idea about how they are inherited. And I'm going to take one example of an autosomal dominant gene or an autosomal dominant disease. What do I mean by autosomal? The gene is carried on one of the autosomes. What are the autosomes? They are the somatic chromosomes. What are the somatic chromosomes? The somatic chromosomes are the chromosomes in your somatic cells. What are your somatic cells? Any body cell other than the testicular and ovarian cells that are making the sex cells, the sperms and ova. When the character is dominant, it's going to manifest itself even in a heterozygous situation. When the character is recessive, it's not going to manifest itself except when it is in a homozygous situation. So as an example of an autosomal dominant disease, it's going to be achondroplasia. Achondroplasia is an autosomal dominant. So if your genotype was uppercase D, we always refer to the dominant gene as an uppercase letter and the recessive gene as a D lowercase letter. So when we say uppercase D, lowercase d, this is a heterozygous situation, but because the D or the achondroplasia gene is a dominant, the heterozygous patient is going to look dwarf, is going to look with achondroplasia. And we can, by doing the Punnett square, we can predict the recurrence risk or the transmission to the offspring. So if this couple with achondroplasia, they can have what? They can have a normal child. This last square with the two lowercase letters, the DD, is a normal kid. So they have 1 in 4 chance to get a normal kid. When it comes to the autosomal recessive inheritance as cystic fibrosis, here you cannot have cystic fibrosis unless you have inherited the bad recessive gene from both your father and your mother. Maybe your father and your mother were normal. They did not look like having the disease because they were heterozygous. But when you inherited one defective copy from your father and one defective copy from your mother, now you are homozygous for the defective recessive gene, and now you have the disease. So in recessive diseases, we have what's called the carrier state. What is the carrier state? You carry the gene, but you do not manifest it because it is carried in a heterozygous condition. You have another normal allele or another normal version that is doing the job. But you can pass this defective gene to your offspring, and if it happened by chance that the offspring inherited the both defective genes from both parents, they will get this autosomal recessive disease. Finally, the X-linked recessive inheritance, the X-linked here, the defective gene is carried, as the name implies, is carried on the X chromosomes. And again, it's recessive. So this defective gene will only manifest itself when it is in a homozygous condition. So a female who's carrying one defective gene on one of the two X's, but the other X is a normal chromosome, will not manifest the disease. And the most famous example is hemophilia. So when a female carrier marries a normal male, there will be a chance that the boy, if the boy inherited the X coming from the mother carrying the defective gene, in a male, the boy is going to have an XY, so this boy is going to bleed because the only X in this boy's body is defective. So this boy will not be able to manufacture the protein called factor 8 in the clotting cascade of the blood, so he's going to be having a hemorrhagic disease or hemophilia A.